Vincent met Annie and Carlo at the Milwaukee Road Depot when they arrived from Chicago. He hugged Annie and shook hands with Carlo and said, "Ma and Pa are staying at the Pfister. Let's get your luggage and we'll go meet them." At the hotel, Annie introduced Carlo to her parents. For a brief moment, John MacRae studied Carlo and then smiled and shook Carlo's hand. "How do you do, young man?" said John MacRae. "Oh, just fine, sir. It's so nice to meet you. Annie has told me so much about you," said Carlo. John MacRae looked at everyone and said, "Let's have dinner tonight at Carl's. Carl, do you like German food?" Carlo grinned and said, "That would be a welcome change from all the lasagna I eat." That evening, they all dined at Carl's restaurant. Vincent was the center of attention as he talked about the expansion he was planning for the MacRae cigar factory. He mentioned adding additional trucks to his fleet. Vincent also mentioned that he was now buying the wrappers for his premium cigars from Cuba. Carlo listened intently to Vincent. Later on, while everyone was sampling Carl's famous apple strudel dessert, Carlo turned to Vincent and said, "Say, Vincent, your cigar factory sounds fascinating. Would you mind giving me a tour? In my work, I sometimes visit a factory, and I always find it interesting to see how things are made." Vincent looked at Carlo and said, "Sure, stop by tomorrow afternoon and I'll give you the 10-cent tour." Annie said, "I'd like to go along too. It's been a long time since I've seen Grandpa's factory." John MacRae noticed that Carlo was studying Vincent intently. When they were alone back at the Pfister, John MacRae said to Molly, "I'm a little concerned. There's something about that Carlo person, but I can't put my finger on it." Molly put her finger on John MacRae's lips and said, "Oh, you just shush. He looks like a nice young man. You're getting too suspicious in your old age. Don't spoil it for Annie." John MacRae thought to himself, "Better suspicious than careless." Later that evening, Annie slipped into Carlo's hotel room. They made love passionately twice. Annie returned to her room early in the morning. Everyone had breakfast together at the cafe in the Pfister. That afternoon, Vincent gave Carlo and Annie a tour of the MacRae cigar factory. Carlo seemed most interested in Vincent's fleet of trucks and his contacts in Cuba. Carlo ran his hand along the floor of several trucks. The next day, John and Molly MacRae took a train back to Deadwood, South Dakota. Carlo and Annie returned to Chicago. Carlo reported to Don or Meadow. The Don motioned to Carlo to sit down and said, "So what have you learned about the cigar business?" Carlo smiled and said, "It's perfect. They have about a dozen trucks in their fleet, and soon they'll be getting more. But it gets even better. They buy some of their tobacco from Cuba. And guess who from?" "Who?" said the Don impatiently. "The Escara family. Don't we buy some rum from them? I'm sure booze could easily be smuggled in with their tobacco shipments. The MacRaes have a good reputation, and besides, who would think to look in a bale of tobacco for booze?" said Carlo. The Don nodded and smiled slightly and said, "Yes, I've dealt with old man Escaro. We go back a long way. You have done well, Carlo. Do you think we can convince that Vincent person to go along with us?" Carlo patted the pearl-handled 1911 pistol that he carried in his shoulder holster and said, "I'm sure we can." The Don's face took on a serious look. He said, "No rough stuff on the MacRaes. Business is good. We don't want to get greedy. If the MacRaes don't agree to do this, then we will let it go. Understood, Carlo?" "Yes, my Don," said Carlo. The Don stroked his cheek and said, "But we must be careful. Alert our people in Milwaukee to keep an eye on the MacRaes. You know what happened with your uncle. Do not discuss this with that girl either." 3 days later, Carlo drove a black Ford Model T coupe to Milwaukee. He cursed the Ford for its lack of power, but did not want his Packard seen in Milwaukee. Carlo's visit was a surprise to Vincent, and he said, "Hello, Carlo, good to see you. What brings you to Milwaukee?" Carlo shook Vincent's hand and said, "I'm here on some business, and I thought maybe you could have lunch with me." Vincent said, "Sure, just give me a few minutes to finish going over an order with my superintendent. Have a seat, I'll be right back." Vincent drove Carlo to the Mason Street pub in his white 1920 Rolls-Royce limousine. As Carlo entered the auto, he patted the hood and said with a grin, "I should be in the cigar business." Vincent did not answer Carlo's remark. At the Mason Street pub, Carlo and Vincent each ordered a porterhouse steak along with a bottle of Cabernet. After some small talk, Vincent looked at Carlo and said, "Who are you seeing on business here in Milwaukee? Maybe I know them." Carlo flashed a quick smile and said, "Oh, you do know them. It's you I want to talk to." With a surprised look, Vincent said, "What can I do for you, Carlo?" Carlo leaned closer to Vincent and in a serious tone said, "It's what I can do for you. I have a proposition that will make you a very wealthy man. What I'm about to tell you must not be discussed with anyone else. I represent a business that distributes liquor in Chicago and northern Illinois. We want to use your trucks to expand into other states. I've looked at your trucks, and with false bottoms on the floors, it would be foolproof. Also, you do business in Cuba with the Esquerra family. We do business with a different part of the Esquerra family. They sell us rum. It would make getting the rum much easier for us if they could be concealed and shipped in tobacco bales. Again, this would be foolproof. You would be..." Vincent interrupted Carlo and said, "I don't think this is a good idea for our family. We are doing okay and don't need the risk. Besides, I'd have to run this by my father, and I know he would never give his approval." Carlo pointed his finger at Vincent and in a harsh tone said, "This deal is strictly between you and me. I'm warning you not to discuss this with anyone else or you'll be very sorry. I'll give you some time to think about this." Vincent stood up and in a loud tone said, "I don't need any time to think. My answer is no. And another thing, I want you to stop seeing my sister, you son of a bitch." Carlo stood up and said, "Remember, don't discuss it with anyone or else." "Or else what?" said Vincent. His face was flushed with anger. Carlo motioned to a nearby waiter and said, "Hey, you, call me a cab." He turned to Vincent and with a smirk said, "That was a damn good steak, my friend. Thank you." Carlo took a cab back to the black Model T. He wondered what Don Armedo would have to say. When Carl told the Don about Vincent's refusal, Don Armedo did not seem concerned and said, "Let this go." Vincent drove his white Rolls-Royce back to the MacRae cigar factory and wondered if he should tell his father about Carlo's proposition. On the way back to the cigar factory, Vincent decided not to involve his father. He remembered a young man he had met while taking an accounting class at a local business school. The young man's name was Harry Bender. Harry was an FBI agent who needed to get a background in accounting for an upcoming investigation he would be performing. Harry was a short man with an athletic build and youthful appearance. His light blonde hair was slicked back to make him appear older. Harry had a cheerful demeanor. He and Vincent became close friends. They frequently had lunch together and enjoyed Milwaukee's nightlife together. Rather suddenly, Harry became very involved in his work and rarely met with Vincent. Vincent phoned Harry and asked to meet him for dinner. Harry said he was busy, but Vincent persisted, insisting that it was important he talk with Harry. Harry relented and they met for dinner at the Mason Street pub. Vincent was surprised by the complete change in Harry's demeanor. Harry now had a serious way about himself and was hard to converse with. After some small talk, mostly by Vincent, Harry looked at Vincent and said, "So what's so important, my friend?" Harry listened intently as Vincent told him about his meeting with Carlo and the proposition Carlo made regarding the use of MacRae's trucks for distributing liquor and smuggling of rum from Cuba. Vincent said, "That son of a bitch had the balls to threaten me. He's been going out with my sister, and I don't think she knows a damn thing about him. I want him out of the way for her sake. Can you report this to your superiors for me?" Harry's face was grim as he leaned towards Vincent and in a quiet, serious tone said, "You don't know who the hell you are dealing with. I'm telling you as a friend, do not, I repeat, do not discuss this with anyone. Just let this lay. Just forget about it." "So you won't help me," said Vincent. "I told you leave this lay. These aren't schoolboys you are dealing with," said Harry. Vincent stood up and said, "If you won't help me, I'll find someone who will. You aren't the only FBI agent in town." 2 days later, Don Armedo summoned Carlo to an immediate meeting. While driving over to the Don's residence, Carlo wondered what the big urgency was. When he entered Don Armedo's study, the Don told him to close the door and sit down. With a grim look on his face, Don Armedo said, "Thank you for coming right over. Carlo, we have a big problem on our hands. That MacRae person has been talking to the FBI in Milwaukee about our proposal. We got a call from Bender this morning. He talked to Bender about your meeting. Bender warned him to keep his mouth shut. He didn't listen to Bender and started talking to another FBI agent. Fortunately for us, this agent is also on our payroll. That cigar guy must be taken care of at once. I'm going to send one of our best men up to Milwaukee for this job. I want you to tell him what you know about this cigar guy. It will..." Carlo interrupted the Don and said, "Don Armedo, let me do this piece of work for you. I know this guy's habits." The Don was not used to being interrupted. He frowned and said, "And what about that girl you're screwing? You'd be killing her brother." Carlo gave Don Armedo a wicked grin and said, "This will be a real pleasure for me. Strange as it may seem to you, I somehow blame her for my Uncle Pete. Someday I'm going to take care of her, too." The Don was surprised at Carlo's response and said, "I will let you do this job for us, but I warn you to be careful. Make it look like a robbery." Carlo smiled and nodded and said, "I know what to do." Carlo gave the Don a hug and left. The next day, Carlo drove a black Model T coupe to Milwaukee. He dressed in coveralls, wore a fake blonde mustache, and kept a cap on at all times. Carlo rented a room in a small town north of Milwaukee. Carlo spent 2 days studying Vincent's habits and his daily routine. On the third day after Vincent left for work, Carlo followed Vincent to the cigar factory. Carlo waited for 3 hours, then walked over to Vincent's apartment. It was on the ground floor, and Carlo easily got in through an unlocked side window. He sat in a red leather chair and waited. Vincent would usually go to his apartment before going out for dinner, so Carlo figured on about a 5-hour wait. Carlo surveyed the apartment and thought it was rather austere for a man who drove a Rolls-Royce Phantom limousine. Carlo broke into a small lockbox that he discovered. It contained over $5,000 in cash. Carlo smiled and knew that this amount of cash would definitely make this look like a robbery. While waiting, Carlo smoked several cigarettes. When the time grew nearer for Vincent to return, Carlo opened up a window and tossed the cigarette butts outside. When Carlo heard a key enter the door's lock, he pulled out a stiletto and positioned himself next to the door. Carlo knew from experience to strike swiftly and without warning. Too many jobs went badly when the victim was told why he was being killed. As Carlo entered his apartment, Carlo grabbed him from behind and thrust the stiletto into Vincent's back. As Vincent fell to the floor, Carlo stabbed him twice in the chest. Vincent looked up at Carlo and weakly said, "You!" With a swift and deliberate motion, Carlo slit Vincent's throat. Vincent MacRae was no more. Carlo smiled and then took the cash and left. He drove back to Chicago and reported to Don Armedo. Carlo told the Don how he killed Vincent and of the cash that he took. Carlo offered the cash to Don Armetto. The Don told Carlo that he did good and to keep the cash for himself. John MacRae received a telegram informing him of his son's fate. He placed a long-distance call to Annie. John MacRae told Annie of her brother's demise and asked her to meet him in Milwaukee. John MacRae told Annie the details of Vincent's murder and that the Milwaukee Detective Bureau said the motive was most likely robbery. One detective said that the robber spent some time waiting in Vincent's apartment before the robbery. He found several Camel cigarette butts outside a window, and there was the faint smell of cigarette smoke in the apartment. After getting settled in the Pfister Hotel, John MacRae suggested to Annie and Molly that tomorrow afternoon they all go over to Vincent's apartment. The next day, John, Molly, and Annie MacRae entered Vincent's apartment. Earlier, John MacRae had the bloodstains removed so Molly would not see the horror of Vincent's death. John MacRae picked up the damaged lockbox and said, "Vincent always kept several $1,000s in cash in this box." The detectives say that Vincent's murder is a result of Vincent discovering the robber or robbers. Many would kill for a much lesser sum. Why don't you two look around and see if there's anything of Vincent's you want to take with you as a memento? Annie and Molly both declined John MacRae's offer. John MacRae turned to them and said, "Please sit down. I've got something I want to say." Annie and Molly sat down on a large brown leather sofa. Molly was wiping tears from her eyes. Annie said quietly, "What is it, Father?" John MacRae looked down and bit his lip, then looked up at Annie and said abruptly, "Annie, I want you to run a cigar business. You have the intelligence and experience to run a business." Annie and Molly both looked at John MacRae with astonishment. Molly said, "Why, Annie? Haven't you had enough of the cigar business? It cost us a son. Sell the damn thing." John MacRae ignored Molly's remark. He looked at Annie and said, "Annie, please, I want to keep the cigar factory in our family. Please say yes." Annie stood up and said, "I must say no to you, Father. I've worked long and hard to build a career in the fashion industry. You can't ask me to give up what I love doing." "I agree with Mom. Sell the damn business. Let's get out of here." John MacRae stood up and with a deep sigh said, "Annie, at least think about it. Well, let's get some dinner." As they walked towards the door, Annie noticed an object on an end table next to a red leather chair. She studied the object, and a look of horror appeared on her face. It was Carlo's gold cigarette case. She quickly composed herself and said, "I'll take this with me." Annie put the object into her purse. As John MacRae was driving back to the Pfister, he turned to Annie and said, "Why don't you take Vincent's automobile?" Annie said, "No, thank you. Chicago has too much traffic for me." John MacRae said, "Well, suit yourself. Let's meet at 7 o'clock for dinner." When Annie was back in her room at the hotel, she pulled the gold cigarette case from her purse. A large letter C was engraved on the cover, and inside were 7 Camel cigarettes. She could hear her heart pounding as she flew into a rage. Annie angrily threw the gold cigarette case against the wall and said out loud, "You bastard, you will pay for this." Annie decided not to tell her father what she found. She would take care of Carlo herself. The MacRae family dined at Carl's German restaurant. During dinner, John and Molly MacRae reminisced about Vincent. Annie was noticeably silent throughout the meal. She finally broke her silence and said, "Father, I've changed my mind. I will run the family business for you." A look of amazement appeared on John MacRae's face, and he said, "I'm so happy to hear that, but what changed your mind?" Annie lied and said, "Well, you want to keep Grandpa's cigar factory in the MacRae family. I'm going to need some time to learn the business, and I do want to give Mr. Marcus some notice. The Marcus Fashion Company has been very good to me. You will have to help me learn your cigar business. Oh, I will also take Vincent's automobile. I hear Milwaukee's traffic is tolerable. John MacRae smiled and said, "It's not my cigar business. It will be your cigar business. I'll arrange to have the stock titled in your name." Annie gave a sinister smile and said, "Thank you, Father. I won't let you down." Molly remained silent, and Annie thought how she would kill Carlo, while John MacRae talked about his days at his father's cigar factory. Annie drove the Rolls-Royce back to Chicago. She was amazed at the power and smoothness of this automobile compared to the Model T she once owned. Annie then thought of her rides in Carlo's Packard, and an idea came to her. She started to devise a plan to kill Carlo that would include the Rolls-Royce. After returning to Chicago, Annie gave the Marcus Fashion Company her notice. The same day, Carlo stopped by her office. He hugged Annie and said, "Where were you? I've been looking for you all week. Are you okay?" "I'm okay, but my brother isn't. He was murdered during a robbery." "I was at the funeral with my family," said Annie, as she looked into Carlo's eyes. Carlo had anticipated the question and had an answer prepared. With a sad look, Carlo said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry to hear that. I really like that guy. Is there anything I can do?" Trying not to show any emotion, Annie said, "Thank you, but everything has been taken care of." Carlo said, "Can I see you tonight?" "How about tomorrow afternoon?" "There is one thing you could help me with," said Annie with a faint smile. Annie took Carlo's hand and led him to the window. She pointed to the white Rolls-Royce parked down below in the street and said, "That's my car down there. It belonged to my brother. My father insisted that I take it. There's been a lot of hijackings lately around here, and I'm scared. You told me that sometimes you carry a gun for work. Could you show me how to use one?" Carlo said, "Sure, I'd be happy to." "Well, what kind of gun should I buy? I know nothing about them. In fact, I've never even fired one," said Annie. She lied. At a young age, her father taught her to be an excellent shot. Annie enjoyed shooting rifles and pistols, but shied away from shotguns. Carlo took Annie's hand, patted it, and said, "Don't bother to buy anything right now. I've got one I'd like you to try first. I'll pick you up around 3. The next day, Carlo arrived at Annie's apartment. Once inside, he hugged and kissed Annie passionately. Carlo said, "I've missed you." Carlo and Annie ended up making love together on her sofa. While they were making love, each thought about how they would kill the other. After they finished, Carlo pulled out a cigarette out of a package and lit it. It was a Camel. Annie noticed the absence of the gold cigarette case but said nothing. Annie said, "Carlo, let me drive. Maybe you can give me some tips." Carlo smiled and said, "Okay with me. I've never ridden in a Rolls-Royce." They had an early dinner in Cicero at the same restaurant where Pete Rochi had his last meal. Carlo talked Annie into having lasagna. They both engaged in meaningless small talk throughout the meal. Carlo asked their waiter for the check and said, "It's still light out. How would you like that shooting lesson now?" Annie nodded and said, "Oh, that would be great, but we don't have any guns with us." Carlo opened up his suit coat. He patted the pearl-handled 1911 pistol in his shoulder holster. "I brought some pistols with me, but I've got something smaller in my pocket for you to try first. This one here may be too much for you to handle at first." Carlo directed Annie to drive to the secluded area behind the abandoned ballpark. Carlo and Annie walked into the wooded area. Carlo set up some empty bottles. Carlo always kept his guard up. He was going to make sure that Annie was not familiar with firearms of any kind. He would test her. Carlo retrieved a .32 caliber Colt Model 1903 pistol from his suit coat pocket. There were 8 rounds in the magazine, but nothing in the chamber. He explained how to aim the pistol and handed it to Annie. Carlo said, "Never point a gun at anyone unless you're ready to shoot them. Now try to hit those bottles." Using a one-handed grip, Annie aimed and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. Annie looked at Carlo with a puzzled look and said, "It doesn't work. What am I doing wrong?" Carlo grinned and said, "You have to rack the slide." Annie looked more confused and said, "Rack the slide? How do I do that?" Carlo took the pistol from Annie and said, "Here, I'll show you." Carlo racked the slide, putting a round in the chamber. Convinced that Annie knew nothing about firearms, Carlo handed the pistol back to Annie and said, "Now aim at the target and squeeze the trigger slowly." Using a two-handed grip, Annie swiftly aimed the pistol at Carlo's forehead and said, "Like this, you bastard?" She squeezed the trigger, and a .32 caliber bullet hit Carlo between the eyes. Carlo's eyes widened as he slumped to the ground. Annie stood over Carlo and fired 3 more rounds into his chest. Carlo Rocci was no more. Annie spit on Carlo and collected the 4 spent .32 cases. She put the spent brass back in her purse along with the Colt 1903 pistol and drove back to her apartment. She filled her bathtub with warm water. She sank down in the bathtub with a bottle of scotch. Annie's thoughts raced back to the shooting of Carlo. She had sensed that Carlo was testing her and played ignorant about racking the slide. Annie had been taught by her father how to shoot a 1911 Colt pistol. She knew all about racking the slide on a semi-automatic pistol. Annie wished Carlo would have given her his pearl-handled 1911, but the .32 caliber Colt model 1903 did the job. Annie smiled and took a big swig of scotch. Carlo's body was found 3 days later by 2 boys who were in the woods hunting with slingshots. Carlo's eyes were still wide open, and his pearl-handled 1911 was still in the shoulder holster. When Don Armedo was informed of Carlo's death, he was deeply puzzled. How could this happen to Carlo, who was a capable and careful individual? The Don made inquiries but found nothing. He concluded that this was probably revenge for someone that Carlo had killed and gave no more thought about Carlo's demise. 2 days later, Annie went back to Marcus Fashions. She spent the next week bringing her successor, Marge Nelson, up to date on all of her current projects. During that week, Annie would excuse herself frequently to use the restroom in her office. Marge Nelson could hear Annie's violent retching. Marge finally said, "Are you okay, Miss MacRae? You sound terrible. It's none of my business, but you need to see a doctor. You might have that flu that's going around. Some people have died from it." Annie knew that it was not the flu and forced a smile and then said, "I'll be just fine. Now let's talk about the Marshall Field account." After her final week at Marcus Fashions, Annie drove back to Milwaukee to meet her father. John MacRae had stayed in Milwaukee to oversee the MacRae cigar factory until Annie was available. Annie knocked on the door of her father's room at the Pfister Hotel. She hugged her father. He stepped back and noticed his daughter's haggard appearance and became alarmed. John MacRae said, "Annie, you look terrible. What's wrong?" Annie started to cry and then collapsed into her father's arms. Annie said, "Father, I'm pregnant. I don't want to have this baby." John MacRae was speechless. He gathered his thoughts and said, "Did I hear right? You don't want this baby? Why not?" Annie screamed and said, "Carlo is the father. It was Carlo who killed Vincent, and I killed Carlo." John MacRae sat down on the edge of the bed. He buried his face in his hand and said, "Oh my God." In great detail, Annie told her father about her relationship with Carlo, how she found out Carlo killed her brother, and how she killed Carlo. Annie also said that Carlo's last name was Rocci, and he was the nephew of Pete Rocci. There was no article about the death of Carlo in the Chicago newspapers, only a brief obituary. John MacRae hugged Annie and tearfully said, "I'm so sorry I dragged you into this. You don't have to work in the cigar business if you don't want to. Go back to your career in Chicago, but I'm going to ask you, please, have this baby. I will." Annie interrupted her father and said, "No, Carlo killed my brother and your son." John MacRae looked into his daughter's eyes and said, "Annie, I understand your feelings, but please listen to me. Part of a MacRae is in that baby. I will give that baby our name and raise it as a MacRae. I believe that life begins at conception, and it would be a grievous sin to kill that innocent child. That baby cannot be held responsible for his father's evil acts." Annie kissed her father and said, "Okay, Father, I will have the baby, but understand that I will have nothing to do with it. The baby will be your responsibility. Take it back to South Dakota with you. You can tell it that I'm its aunt. Now I want to start learning the cigar business. I'm a MacRae."